Tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern over on Jaguar Gator 8, a new college football video drops. In this video, we'll talk about a bizarre situation involving Baylor football in the 1990s, and how it actually might have benefited them to lose. Click the card in the upper right corner to join the channel. And now, on with our feature presentation. This man right here is one of the greatest coaches in the history of football. Jimmy Johnson didn't coach a lot of seasons in the NFL, but of the ones he did coach, he definitely made them count. After turning the University of Miami into a college football juggernaut, going 34-2 over his final 3 seasons there, finishing inside the top 2 of the AP poll 3 times in that stretch, and being declared the national champions in 1987, following an undefeated season culminating in an Orange Bowl win, he took his talents to the Dallas Cowboys. There, he took over a team that had been reeling throughout the second half of the 1980s, and turned them into one of football's greatest dynasties, winning back-to-back Super Bowls by defeating the Buffalo Bills at both Super Bowl 27 and Super Bowl 28. And then, while his time with the Miami Dolphins wasn't the best by any means, he still did a pretty good job there, going 36-28, guiding Miami to 3 playoff appearances in 4 seasons, and guiding them to the divisional round twice. There's a reason that Johnson is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and graces those halls. He's an awfully good football coach that did a ton of good things throughout his career. This is not one of them. Not even close. Because even though you might not necessarily know about this or be aware of it, it deserves a deep dive a quarter of a century later. Because Johnson's logic here not only didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense on the surface, and not only did it seem blatantly unfair to the player involved, but it might have cost his team the game in the process. In Week 9 of the 1997 season, the Miami Dolphins were playing the Chicago Bears down at Pro Players Stadium, and Johnson had a very weird decision with regards to his starting lineup that didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense at the time, and made even less sense when you realized why he did it. Because this is the story behind the worst coaching moment of Jimmy Johnson's entire career. Before I break down the decision in question and how baffling it was on so many levels, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as the player in question that was being impacted by Johnson's lineup change. It's October 27th, 1997. It's Week 9 of the NFL season, and as we hit the halfway point, we have an inter-conference matchup on our hands down in Miami, under the lights of Monday Night Football between the Miami Dolphins and the Chicago Bears. Now, this game was never supposed to be played on Monday night. In fact, the game was originally scheduled for Sunday, October 26th, but because the Florida Marlins were playing in the World Series that night and they needed the stadium for Game 7, this game had to be moved back a day. It's not the first time that there was a bizarre conflict between the NFL and the World Series, as you can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, it did mean that this game was going to be under the lights, just like when the two teams famously met in 1985. Although this time, instead of being broadcast to 100% of the country, it was only being broadcast to about 7%, because the rest of the country was getting the Super Bowl 31 rematch between the Green Bay Packers and the New England Patriots, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. As for the Dolphins, to say that this game was huge for them would be a massive understatement. Entering this game at the halfway point of the season, they were sitting at 5-2, and were in the middle of a dogfight, not just for the AFC East, but for the playoffs in general. The Dolphins, with a win, would take first place in the division, as they, along with the New England Patriots and the New York Jets, had 5 wins apiece. And the Dolphins were one of a whopping 8 teams in the AFC with 5 wins at this point, with another 4 teams right behind them at 4 wins. In other words, with only 6 teams making the playoffs and 12 teams either in or 1 game within a spot, this was going to be a battle the rest of the way with not a lot of room for error, making this game for Miami almost feel like a must-win of sorts, especially since they were playing a Chicago team that was the worst team in football. The Bears entered this game as nearly 10-point underdogs, and it's not hard to see why. They were 0-7, they had the worst point differential in the league, they had the 4th worst defense in the NFL and the 2nd worst defense in the NFC, and the worst offense in the NFL. This game felt like a golden opportunity on so many levels for the Dolphins. And if Miami was going to win this game, as a lot of people thought they would, then they needed a great outing out of this man right here. This is Karim Abdul-Jabbar, not the basketball player who spells his name with 2 E's. This is the football player who spells his name with an I. Yes, this was confusing, and yes, this would lead to the basketball player eventually suing the football player. But regardless, one thing that wasn't confusing is the fact that Abdul-Jabbar was really good. In 1996, as a rookie with the Dolphins, the former UCLA runner had over 1,100 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns, finishing 6th in the league in rushing touchdowns. He became the first Dolphin since 1992 to run for over 900 yards in a season, and amazingly enough, became the first Dolphin since all the way back in 1978 to rush for over 1,000 yards in a season. Seems incredible that it took nearly 2 decades for that to happen, but here we were. And in 1997, he was showing no signs of slowing down, picking up right where he left off. Because the week before this game, in Week 8 on October 19th, the Dolphins traveled up to Baltimore to take on the Ravens. And as the Dolphins won the game 24-13, it was very apparent that this would not have been possible without Abdul-Jabbar, because he played the best game of his career. During this game, he got 22 carries for 108 yards, averaging nearly 5 yards per carry, and scoring 3 rushing touchdowns in the first half, punching it in from 5 yards out in the first quarter, again from 5 yards out in the first quarter, and from 6 yards out in the second quarter. The Dolphins scored 3 touchdowns on this day, and Abdul-Jabbar had all 3, as he single-handedly put the Ravens in an early hole that they could not get out of. It was also the most rushing touchdowns that anyone had ever scored on the Ravens in one game at the time. After the game, head coach Jimmy Johnson said on the career best performance from his running back, "We've got to run the ball if we're going to have any success. We understand that." Keep that quote in the back of your mind when we consider what's about to happen next, because this is what we call in the industry foreshadowing. Abdul-Jabbar showed up to practice every day that week and was getting ready for the big game against the Chicago Bears to jump up to first place in the AFC East and put themselves in a good position for the playoffs as we headed toward the second half of the season. And everything seemed to be going according to plan. Everyone knew that the Dolphins needed to get him going and get him involved like they did against Baltimore, especially since the Dolphins were 3-0 so far in 1997 when Abdul-Jabbar had at least 50 yards rushing. And the Bears realized this too, with former Dolphin and 3-time Pro Bowl linebacker Brian Cox saying that the Bears were going to hold them to under 100 yards, even so much as guaranteeing it. But that Friday, just 2 days before when the game was supposed to be played, Abdul-Jabbar missed practice and was nowhere to be found at the team facility. The reason for that? Well, it was so much bigger than football. Because on Friday, October 24th, Karim's wife, Sabria, gave birth to their second child, Hind. In Islam, the name Hind means out of the darkness will come the Creator. And like any good father and any decent person, Karim wanted to be there to see the birth of his daughter. Now keep in mind that Karim had complete permission from the coaching staff to miss practice and to be there. He informed the team that she was due, and he was excused from practice, returning to the team the very next day after the successful delivery. So if he was excused, he was coming off of the best game of his career, was an instrumental part in the team's success, and was at practice every day besides that one, and knew the game plan, and even had an extra day to learn the game plan due to the game getting moved to Monday night, meaning that it was kind of like he missed no preparation time at all. You'd think that this would be a complete non-story, right? You'd think that Abdul-Jabbar would be in the starting lineup for that game against the Bears, looking to pick up right where he left off from that 108-yard, 3-touchdown game the previous week. You'd think that's what head coach Jimmy Johnson would do in this situation, right? Well, if you thought that, guess what? You're wrong. Oh, you are so wrong. Because for some reason, Jimmy Johnson decided that for this game, Abdul-Jabbar would not be starting. Instead, Johnson opted to go with Irving Spikes, a man who, over his last 8 games, was averaging 2.9 yards per carry, and over his last 5 games, was averaging 2.8 yards per carry. He opted to go with Irving Spikes, a man who had been in the NFL since 1994 and had done next to nothing, and actually saw his yards per carry average decline every single season. Instead of going with the running back that was coming off of an over 100-yard performance with 3 touchdowns that won you the game, he went with one of the worst running backs in football. And the reason why? In Johnson's eyes, Spikes was more comfortable with the game plan because Abdul-Jabbar wasn't at practice that one day. But Johnson wanted to make one thing very clear. Abdul-Jabbar wasn't being punished for missing practice. And yet, even though Abdul-Jabbar wasn't being punished, he was being benched. So explain that one to me, because that sounds like a punishment. There's so much wrong with this that I don't even know where to begin. First off, how can you say that someone isn't being punished for missing practice, and then you decide not to start them specifically because they missed practice? How does that make any sense? Imagine if I'm working for a sales company. The company just had a good quarter, and I'm coming off of my best quarter ever from the standpoint of closing deals and making the company money. It's now the start of a brand new quarter, and everyone is required to attend a company-wide meeting to go over the goals and objectives for the next 3 months. I've never missed a day of work, and I've never missed one of these meetings when they come up every quarter. However, that day, my son wakes up with a 104-degree fever and is vomiting, and I have to get him to the hospital. I asked the company if I can miss work to take care of this urgent matter, and they say, "Of course, hope your kid feels better." I get back into work the next day, and I'm informed that even though I'm not being punished for missing the meeting, especially since it was excused, I'm going to be temporarily demoted. Aside from the fact that this scenario just feels so wrong and so gross, how can you say that you're not punishing me for missing the meeting that you let me miss, and then demote me and say that it's not a punishment? You know what we call it when someone misses time and subsequently gets a lesser role than they had before? We call it a punishment. It doesn't matter what Jimmy Johnson thinks that word means. That's just what it is. At the end of the day, no matter how you want to slice it, by not starting Abdul-Jabbar and by not giving him any carries in the first half of the game, you're punishing him for not being there at practice. I know that Abdul-Jabbar and Johnson haven't always had the greatest relationship in the world. Even back in 1996, when Abdul-Jabbar signed his rookie contract, it seemed like he was pressured to do so after Johnson said that if he didn't, he would drop down to number 5 on the depth chart. He even said that during training camp in 1996, he toyed with the idea of cutting him, despite him being a 3rd-round pick. And even when Abdul-Jabbar got the game ball after his great game against the Ravens, he got a stern talking to in front of the team for losing a fumble, making for an awkward celebratory moment. As Johnson said during that celebration in the locker room, "I made a point of letting him know that I didn't like the fumble. I don't care if a guy runs for 10 yards a carry. If he turns it over, he's not going to be in the picture on my team." Keep in mind that the game against the Ravens was the first time he fumbled, not just lost a fumble, but fumbled in general, all year. So Johnson had something against Abdul-Jabbar from day one for some reason that we don't really know why. But this whole incident is nothing short of ridiculous. To bench someone because they weren't at practice, even though they were witnessing the birth of their daughter, and got permission from you to miss practice, and then to say that you're not punishing them for missing practice, even though that's clearly what you're doing by changing their job status and role for the game? This just doesn't sit right at all. And as for how this benching worked out, where he didn't start the game and didn't get any carries in the first half, well, Miami's offense struggled pretty heavily in the first half. Partly because, shocker, they had no run game. Irving Spikes had 4 rushing yards in the first half. That was it. That was the production they got out of their starting running back that day. And the Dolphins found themselves down 15-7 at one point late in the half due to this inefficiency on offense. Sure enough, the Dolphins lost this game, giving Chicago their first win of the season in rather stunning fashion. And while I can't say that not playing Abdul-Jabbar for the first 30 minutes was the main reason they lost, as they did blow a 15-point lead midway through the 4th quarter, so the defense has to take a ton of the blame there, it definitely didn't help their cause at all. It seemed like a loss that Miami could not afford to have, and a loss that was entirely preventable. But Jimmy Johnson just had to go ahead and do that, and mess up Miami's offensive game plan in the first half, that apparently Abdul-Jabbar wasn't comfortable with because he missed one measly practice. Let's be blunt. Any demotion in this context, where you're coming off of the best performance of your career, is a punishment. Remember the whole situation with Jonas Gray and the New England Patriots? You wouldn't call that not a punishment. So for Johnson to say that Abdul-Jabbar wasn't being punished for this is absolute nonsense, and I think he knows it. Jimmy Johnson had a ton of great moments throughout his career as a head coach, but this was definitely not one of them. Because for Karim Abdul-Jabbar, through absolutely no fault of his own, as his newborn daughter entered the world, his playing time exited. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.